Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. New York, Brooklyn. One of those gray evenings when a light drizzle makes the streets slippery and eerily silent. In a dark hooded jacket tucked into his jeans, James Williams walks leisurely down the busy street. There is a bustle of activity, the signs of the stalls gleaming in the light reflected from the wet asphalt. He walks into the nearest store to buy water and immediately feels the stares that pierce him like X-rays. James, a tall black man with a serious look and broad shoulders, seems withdrawn and aloof. There is nothing defiant in his behavior. He respects the personal space of others, takes his time, carefully picks up the goods on the shelf and heads for the cash register. But even his collectedness and habitual poise do not save him from incessant attention. He knows that such attention almost always means one thing: someone has already mistaken him for a problem person without even recognizing who he really is. As James leaves the store, he notices a patrol car parked across the street. Behind the wheel sits Officer Rangers, a white police officer known for his predilection for escalated, violent arrests. At that moment, James senses that something is going wrong. Rangers slowly turns his gaze toward him and smiles with the corners of his lips, like a predator waiting for prey. James walks on, ignoring the policeman, but with each step a sense of wariness grows in him. He pretends not to notice the car, but he feels Rangers' piercing gaze on him. The policeman notices even the smallest of James's movements, the way he carefully rounds the dumpster, doesn't step off the sidewalk, doesn't look around. But to the officer, these are all just oddities that confirm his stereotypical suspicions. The Rangers slowly pull into the middle of the road, stopping the car right in front of James, blocking his path. James looks at him calmly and takes a step to the side to get around the police car, but the officer moves too, blocking his path. An unpleasant fire glows in his eyes, a mixture of dislike and overbearing superiority. Rangers finally turns on his flashing lights and gets out of the car. "Hey, you," he said roughly, coming toward James. "Something seems suspicious to me about what you're doing here." "Huh?" James politely but firmly replies that he is just going home after shopping. He tries not to raise his voice, though he would like to fight back. That look, full of contempt and arrogance, hurts deeper than any accusation. James knows not to fight back. He realizes that, but still he notices his hands start to shake a little, clench into fists, despite his outward calm. The officer walks slowly up to James, examining him from head to toe, and smirks involuntarily, as if he is already judging him in advance for imagined crimes. It seems that to him James is not a person, but a set of prejudices and fears. Rangers asks another question, sharply and deliberately derogatory. There seems to be something about the way James stands that makes him even more suspicious, as if he expects this evening to end uneasily. Without losing his dignity, James stands his ground. He has done nothing wrong. He answers the questions, looking calmly into the officer's eyes, his gaze as if to say, "I know who you see me as, but that's not my story." He checks the time on his phone, mentally estimating how long it will be before someone pays attention to what's going on. Officer Henry Rangers, a 38-year-old police officer with a scowl and a sturdy build, has always considered himself a true policeman. For him, his job was not just a duty, it was his personal battlefield, where he fought crime like a hero. But whereas his colleagues saw criminals as enemies of the law, Rangers saw them as enemies in a different way. He didn't feel it necessary to hide his prejudiced views of people, especially black men, whom he automatically considered either gangsters or drug dealers. Rangers began his service in one of the city's most disadvantaged neighborhoods. As a young officer, he experienced violent encounters with street gangs, shootings, violent fights and street thefts. He went through all these trials, but they only strengthened his conviction that crime is not just a matter of chance, but a trait imprinted in someone's blood. For Rangers, the difference between a good citizen and a criminal was merely a matter of choice. The white man, Rangers believed, was supposed to represent order, authority, and discipline. Blacks, in his eyes, were like a virus, a menace that must be suppressed and not given the slightest chance to manifest itself. The police station knew of his views, but preferred to keep quiet. No one wanted a conflict with Henry. He was old dog enough to command respect, and although some of his methods seemed overly harsh to many, there were no official complaints against him. Officer Rangers left no trace, and acted intelligently and thoughtfully. His commanding officer, a man of strict principles, sometimes asked him about incidents in which he had been involved, but always received convincing answers. He had long had a theory in his head that blacks were simply incapable of law-abiding behavior. He used to sarcastically say that they could not be re-educated because, as he often repeated, a tiger can't change his stripes. These thoughts had penetrated his mind so strongly that he now viewed any black person simply walking down the street as a potential threat. Rangers prided himself on his intuition and the art of preventative action. He once stopped a teenager who was just running through a park in a hurry to get to a school practice. The officer suspected the kid had something amiss and detained him, forcing him to spend several hours at the station before he understood the situation. In his eyes, such measures were justified. He always stayed on the lookout. When he saw James Williams that evening, he instinctively awoke the instinct of a predator, certain that he had stumbled upon another sinner. Ranger's gaze was not random. He was looking for features that would confirm his stereotypes. James's calm, collected gait seemed to him contrived. His clothes, however neutral, seemed too street, and his confident gaze seemed almost insolent. Rangers felt on top of his game. For him, there was nothing more thrilling than the feeling of power backed by credentials. He envisioned himself as a judge and administrator of justice, especially in moments when he could humiliate a suspect, make him feel guilty, even if he wasn't. In his eyes, the job was not only a service to the law, but also a way to assert his superiority. And when he saw James that evening, he was sure he was facing another trespasser, another who was supposedly trying to hide behind an external correctness. The rain intensified, and the wind howled, driving passers-by under the awnings of the stores. James Williams, as if oblivious to the weather, walked calmly down the sidewalk, staring straight ahead. He was accustomed to ignore the stares and disapproval that were often bestowed upon him. He had encountered it too often to take it personally. There were plenty of people in his life like that officer in the car behind him, people ready to find a criminal where there wasn't one. The Rangers policeman was still sitting in the car, watching James's every move. He felt compelled to intervene. Something told him that this man with the black eyes and confident gait was hiding more than just a bottle of water in his jacket pocket. Finally, unable to bear it, Rangers swung out of the car and headed toward James, quickly and with a cold fire in his eyes. "Hey, buddy," he called to James with an arrogant tone, as if he was already sure he was guilty. "Stop for a minute. What are you doing out so late? Where are you going?" James stopped and turned around, catching the policeman's wary but icy gaze. Taking a deep breath, he answered calmly, "Just going home. I don't have any violations, officer." Ranger stepped closer without listening, clearly intent on violating James's personal space. His eyes roved over the suspect's figure, as if searching for signs of a hidden crime. "There's something wrong with you," he said, almost hissing, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "You know, I can feel it. Who are you, walking around here at night like this? Ha!" Not a muscle in James's face quivered, but the tension in his gaze became more noticeable. He knew that cops like Rangers like to provoke, to pick at weaknesses, to make them talk under pressure, but James was a trained agent, and he knew how important it was to stay calm. "I have identification," he said, pulling out his wallet. "I don't pose any threat to you, officer." Rangers cast a quick glance at the wallet James held, but didn't bother to move closer to examine the documents. A sneer flashed in his eyes. He didn't see a man with rights, but a suspicious subject, and that was enough to keep the pressure on. "What if there's something else in your wallet besides your ID? What if you have drugs in there?" Rangers grinned, playing with James's quivering nerves. "Maybe you're just trying to trick me. It's time to come clean." James clenched his jaws slightly, but his voice remained calm and confident. "You're wrong, officer. I'm an honest citizen. I'm just going home. Let me continue on my way." But Rangers had already made the decision that felt right to him. He wasn't going to let James go for nothing. A preconceived picture had already formed in his mind. He knew he could pull up some offense if he was only persistent enough. His power was the power of the position, and he was ready to use it to the fullest. "You think saying it politely is going to save you?" Rangers stepped forward again, now almost breathing in James's face. "What if I told you that you've been acting strange, that you've been hanging around and acting suspiciously? Just let you go like that?" James sighed, trying to remain unfazed. He knew that only calm would survive in this game, but the inner rage brought on by the false accusations nearly forced him out of his role. Every inch of his body screamed injustice, but his face remained a mask of equanimity. "Officer, I respect your labor and your work, but I have nothing to confess for, because I haven't done anything," James said firmly, staring intently into Ranger's eyes as if testing his strength and fortitude. Rangers, blushing brightly, felt himself hurt. He was used to the fear in the eyes of the people he stopped. He liked to see their anxiety, their confusion. James, on the other hand, refused to budge, his gaze steady and his words clear and confident. Officer Ranger stood in front of James, hands on his hips, ready to attack, like a beast on the prowl. He decided that a routine check wasn't enough. He needed to squeeze James, make him flinch, show him who was in charge. James remained motionless, glancing once at the street, at the passers-by who were quickening their steps and turning away, trying to avoid any possible connection to the police inspection. Rangers leaned closer, his face only a few inches from James, and he began to whisper, barely audible, but loud enough for his words to penetrate deep under his skin. "I'm not wrong, am I? You've been to the station before? How many times have you been behind bars? Face it, buddy, I can spot a guy like you." Through the hum of the walkie-talkie came the coherent voices that immediately confirmed the arrival of the squad. Rangers took his eyes off the device and stared at James with a cold grin, like a predator who had trapped his prey. "You're not leaving," his voice sounded almost satisfied. "You're not leaving now." But James wasn't going to give in. He stood firm and unyielding, his gaze determined. Despite his inner rage and desire to fight back, he kept his composure. What Rangers didn't know was that this suspicious man was actually a seasoned FBI agent, trained to handle situations that many couldn't. He knew the law, knew his rights, and realized it was time to assert himself. "Officer Rangers," he said firmly without averting his eyes, "you are acting illegally and violating my rights. I have every right to defend myself against unlawful detention." The words flashed in Ranger's ears like a blow. He wasn't used to such words from those he considered his targets. His face contorted with rage, and he tried to grab James again, but James held his hand steady, tighter this time, and said quietly, "I have rights, and I won't let you violate them." Rangers, realizing that his methods were no longer working, was confused. He didn't know what to do next. This situation was something new to him, something that threw him off his rhythm. The dark alleyway lit up with flashing lights, the shrill sounds of sirens drowning out even the roar of the rain. Police Rangers froze, the cocky grin on his face beginning to fade, giving way to obvious confusion. He saw several men in smart suits and trench coats get out of a black SUV, approaching them rapidly, and he knew at once that they were not local patrolmen. These men looked too confident, too collected. They wore badges that indicated they were under the command of a force far superior to the regular police. For a moment, Rangers felt the ground slipping from under his feet. One of the agents, a tall man with a cold stare, approached them, stopping only a few paces away. He glanced at James, who stood still as calmly, but now his face looked sterner, a hidden strength felt in every movement. "Mr. Williams," the agent addressed James, ignoring Rangers, "we got your signal. Is everything all right?" James nodded slightly, his gaze piercing like a knife. "Thank you, Tom. I see you've arrived just in time," he said with absolute certainty, and the words threw Rangers off balance. His face contorted with confusion, but he was still trying to understand what was happening. Rangers took a step forward, not giving up trying to show his importance, and pointed a finger at James. "Who the hell are you people? This man is a suspect. He was resisting the police, disturbing the peace. I was doing my job." His voice sounded harsh, but the tension was obvious, even in the timbre of his voice. Tom, the FBI agent, paid no attention and continued to communicate with James as if Rangers was invisible. "We arrived as soon as you sent the signal, James," Tom said, pulling a folder from an inside pocket. "I'm sure you didn't suffer any misunderstandings." The last words were spoken with emphasized sarcasm, but the agent's tone was icy, barely containing his hatred for the way his colleague was being treated. "It's all right," James nodded, but there was a barely concealed fury in his eyes. "That man," he pointed to Rangers, "decided I was a criminal based solely on what he thought I was. Even after I produced my papers, He continued to use his position to humiliate and intimidate me. Rangers, hearing those words, burst into flames. He stepped forward, no longer in control of his words or emotions. "Oh, is that so?" His voice was shrill, almost hysterical. "I was just doing my job, and this man," he pointed his finger at James, as if he were some kind of public enemy. He decided to play his own game, confronting the police, and something about his rights, and it turns out it's the FBI. Tom met him with a look full of contempt. "Rangers," the agent said, as if addressing a small bully, "this man is Agent Williams. He's been undercover for several years. His mission is far more important than your far-fetched suspicions and feelings. You have no idea how important his work is." Rangers took a step back, his face changing before his eyes from hatred to fear and confusion. He couldn't believe his ears. This suspect was an FBI agent? How was that possible? He felt cornered, realizing that he had just tried to use all his powers against a man who could have easily put him in his place, and by legal means. I didn't know," Rangers muttered. But James, whom he had humiliated for so long, stood before him now as a man quite above him, with dignity and quiet strength. James stepped forward, his gaze cold and impenetrable. "I tried to explain it to you," he said, his voice quiet but threatening, "but you refused to listen. You thought you could control people's fate just because you had a badge. That's not just a violation, Officer Rangers, it's an abuse of power." Agent Tom looked at Rangers and said coldly, "You'll be better off if you stop talking. This is now a matter of internal investigation." James slowly pulled his ID card from the inside pocket of his worn coat. The gold FBI emblem on a blue background glinted in the headlights, cold and convincing, a reflection of his rights and responsibilities. He held it out to Rangers, and his calm but penetrating gaze said, "You underestimated me." Rangers froze. He stared at the emblem as if it were something impossible, as if every corner of the badge burned his gaze. An FBI agent? This man he'd humiliated and poisoned, demanding obedience, turned out to be a federal agent. A steel spring of fear clenched inside him, because he knew that now every move he made and every word he said could backfire on him. During his years of service he had gotten used to hiding his dislike, but this time he had lost control, and now he would have to pay for it. "Do you realize I'm working here, officer?" James said coldly, glaring at Rangers. "I'm not just a random passerby or a suspicious type. I'm an undercover FBI agent, and I'm here to investigate a series of racially motivated crimes. We're tracking these cases and catching anyone who resorts to unfair detentions without justification. So, as you can see, your order work has itself become the subject of an investigation." The surrounding police began to whisper, their eyes darting between James and Rangers. The situation was escalating, and the realization of the truth seemed to penetrate their ranks like cold rain. James continued, raising his voice to be heard by everyone gathered. "Your modus operandi has long attracted our attention. We know how often you resort to unjustified detentions. Your reports have been analyzed by our specialists, and we now have evidence of systematic violations." James's words cut to the heart, revealing a truth that had been glossed over for too long. He wouldn't let Rangers look away, wouldn't let him escape his own reflection in this situation. One of the police officers standing nearby stepped from foot to foot, torn between corporate loyalty and the truth that was evident. Tension hung in the air. It seemed that even the cars were anxious to get away from here, to escape the sharp, untouchable judgment with which James was piercing the defenses James had so carefully built around Rangers. Rangers tried to cope with the fear and despair overwhelming him, his face contorted. He took a step back, trying to find the words, but he didn't know what to say, realizing that his reputation was crumbling before the eyes of his colleagues, who now saw his true face. James looked at him blankly and said, "This isn't just about one crime, officer. It's about the system. It's about your role in the system. You're part of the problem, and I'm here to solve it." He turned to the rest of the police officers, making it clear that his words applied to the entire system that allowed such actions to flourish. Rangers stood in the middle of the street as if paralyzed. His ears were ringing with unspoken words and unfulfilled threats. All his inner calm was shattered. He, always confident of his infallibility, felt the ground slipping from under his feet. With every second he stood in front of James and the FBI agents, the feeling of hopelessness grew stronger. Tom, the senior agent, cast a stern look at him and spoke in a cold, impassive tone. "Officer Rangers, I think we need to discuss the methods you used here. Before we continue, why did you decide to detain Agent Williams? Rangers took a deep breath, about to answer, but felt his heart clench with terror. Everyone present was looking at him with judgment and distrust. He tried to gather himself, but the words stuck in his throat, not knowing how to justify himself to those cold, penetrating stares. I thought he was suspicious, he finally squeezed out. His behavior on the street was, not quite adequate. Tom, without blinking, only raised an eyebrow, displaying icy bewilderment. Inadequate? He interrogated. Inadequate enough to warrant humiliation, threats and detention? Or maybe his inadequacy was that he looked different from what you thought he should look like? Tom didn't raise his voice, but his words cut Rangers harder than any screams. They shattered the illusions in which he had existed for so long, forcing him to see himself through the eyes of those around him. Rangers was stunned and barely knew how to find the words. James watched him with vengeance in his eyes, a silent judgment that spoke for itself. His calm was a weapon now, and he knew his presence was crumbling Rangers' confidence, making him vulnerable. Rangers tried to justify himself, frantically going over phrases. I was just doing my job. I saw that he was acting suspiciously, and I had to check him out. I had a hunch that something was wrong. But before he could speak, Tom interrupted him in a cold, shrill tone. A hunch, you say? A hunch is what a professional relies on. Tom turned to the surrounding police officers, who were standing in the shadows, trying not to draw attention to themselves. Maybe you rely on hunches instead of facts? Racial stereotypes instead of evidence? There was a heavy silence. James was still staring at Rangers in silence, not averting his eyes. His gaze was full of a quiet rage that made the policeman barely able to stand. Rangers realized that every look he had given James, every humiliating word he had said to him in these last few minutes, was now exposed in front of colleagues who might have looked at him with respect before. The senior agent gave him no opportunity to justify himself. Do you realize, Officer Rangers, that all of your actions today are subject to scrutiny? I'm not even talking about the legal ramifications. I'm talking about moral, professional, and I assure you, bias is something the feds don't forgive. At these words James stepped forward, his face serious and adamant. He no longer looked at Rangers as if he were a humiliating officer. Now he saw before him only a pathetic man, cornered by his own prejudices. It's too late to say anything now, Rangers, he said quietly, but so that everyone in that dark alley could hear his words. Everything you've done today will be accounted for, and this is far from over. The following days turned into a nightmare for Rangers. As he began to realize the implications of what had happened, the door to his life began to be cracked open by a force he could not control: the FBI. Every morning he was greeted by stern agents with closed faces and impassive eyes, accompanied by dry formal words. We're conducting a background check. Do you have any questions? At James's behest, a massive audit began. Systematic, cold and merciless. The FBI's long-awaited archives were filled with files of complaints about Rangers, from elderly women, young families, and teenagers whose fault was merely their appearance. Each case was a picture of horror, hidden from the eyes of colleagues but familiar to most of the city's black residents. One by one they told their stories. Mr. Walters, an elderly black veteran, recalled how Rangers had stopped him at an intersection on his way to the store. Without any explanation, Rangers demanded to get out of the car, searched him, treating him as if he were a fugitive. He called me a sneaky old fox and asked me where I had my gun. I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't have the guns, but he didn't believe it. Rangers raised complaints to such high places that they went unnoticed. As it turned out, there were still records in the paper trail, skillfully hidden under the rubric of insufficient evidence. James and his colleagues scrutinized the archives, one by one reconstructing these stories, as if they were embroidering a new picture out of old cloth, where each stitch exposed the raw truth. The story of young Emily Brown did not go unnoticed. She was only 17 when one night, on her way home from rehearsing for a school play, she found herself face to face with Rangers. He stopped her, suspecting suspicious behavior. She was alone, frightened, and he questioned her about where she lived and why she was alone on the street, as if she were not a schoolgirl in front of him, but a criminal. Emily recalled how she tried to explain that she had just been held up at rehearsal, but saw that he was not interested. Over time, the picture became more complete. The testimonies of local residents, now more candid, formed a mosaic of episodes of hatred and humiliation. These revelations overwhelmed police reports, making each sheet a heavy indictment. People whose complaints had been put off for years now had a voice, and the FBI did its best to make them heard. Every word, every accusation, every reminder of another injustice, all of it inexorably distanced Rangers from his former confidence and status. His housemates could no longer ignore the talk behind his back. Neighbors turned away. The station looked on with distrust. Rangers realized that his reputation was ruined, and the realization of it was overwhelming him with a wave of impotent rage. At the finale of the audit, when the complaints were resolved, James gathered the entire team and presented the report to senior FBI management. The confirmation of each of the facts turned out to be not just the conviction of one man, but evidence of deep problems in the system that had allowed this to happen for years. And now the Rangers were destined to give an account for their every move. As soon as the news of James Williams' undercover arrest hit the press, it instantly spread like a firestorm across the city. A veritable storm of public outrage began to erupt online, on television and in the pages of newspapers. Racism in the police, inappropriate acts by an officer, the headlines rattled, giving the story a huge resonance and accelerating its march toward justice. In the first days after the incident, reporters left neither James nor Rangers alone. Noisy discussions, rallies, and loud appeals to local authorities filled the city. People gathered at rallies demanding Rangers' resignation and criminal prosecution, and placards reading "We will no longer be silent" raised not only the issue of racism in the police force, but also that no one should go unpunished. The activists who gathered outside City Hall drew the attention of the general public and journalists who escalated the situation by bringing up the stories of those who had previously been victimized by the Rangers. They replayed their stories of fear, humiliation and powerlessness, appealing to the emotions of the people, who in turn took to the streets, uniting into a single movement. There was a spirit of struggle and unity in the air, growing every day. While the public was on a tide of anger and demand for justice, the police, as if in fear of a storm brewing, were forced to conduct an internal investigation. The internal checks turned out to be more than a mere formality. The entire police station was under a magnifying glass. Every move Rangers and his colleagues were analyzed. Secrets that had previously been carefully hidden began to surface like an abomination being thrown to the surface. Senior FBI investigator, Tom, was once again at the center of events. His job was to oversee the internal investigation as well as work with the press to explain the FBI's actions and the need for an in-depth review of the local police force. He realized that this was not just a case of one man, it was about a system that needed to be overhauled. Meanwhile, newspaper editorials began to run articles full of the truth about what was happening in the police force. Journalists interviewed locals who until then had been afraid to speak openly about the racial injustice that permeated every street in the city. There were reports about those who had been victimized by Rangers' bias, and their experiences brought tears and anger to readers. Rangers, finding himself at the center of the storm, slowly realized that his world was crumbling. He experienced fear, anger, and powerlessness as the full weight of public condemnation fell upon him. He didn't know how to react when his coworkers began to keep their distance from him. "You will need to explain your actions," they said, averting their eyes. And Rangers felt abandoned, as if the walls he had been building had begun to fall. On the evening of one of the days when the wave of condemnation was at its peak, James Williams went to a press briefing to summarize what had happened. His eyes shone with determination and his words were full of power. He talked about his experience, what had happened that day, and his hope for change. "This incident should not be just another story," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We must fight together for justice and equality. We must rebuild trust between the police and the community. It is time for action, and I am ready to be part of that process." James' words stayed in the minds of the locals, raising a wave of hope for change. The struggle was just beginning, and many of those who had previously remained silent were now ready to speak out for justice and equality. The internal investigation launched in the wake of the James Williams incident was developing rapidly. Each new witness, each complaint filed served as a brick in the foundation of the case building up around Rangers. At first it seemed like only a light fog over his career, but as he studied his modus operandi, he began to feel that fog become impenetrable, and worst of all, his breath began to hitch. In the final phase of the investigation, not just a dozen testimonies were collected, there were more than 20. Each of them carried bitterness and resentment, but together they created an undeniable picture of bias, oppression, and abuse of power, and each case turned out to be a verdict for Rangers. As soon as the results of the investigation were announced and the internal panels announced their findings, Rangers was called into the meeting. He stood in front of the panel of investigators, feeling his legs trembling beneath him. Many questions swirled in his mind. How could all this have happened? Why hadn't anyone stood up for him? He had always considered himself clean, a law-abiding officer who was merely performing his duties. The senior FBI investigator who was in charge of the case sat at his desk with a cold, impassive face. He picked up the documents that contained all the evidence and began to read out some of it, so that Rangers could not escape the bitter reality of his actions. You detained people without sufficient grounds, insulted them and used your position to humiliate them. These actions were repeated and purposeful, the investigator said without looking up. We conclude that you violated the law, discriminated against citizens on the basis of race, and used your authority. At this meeting, Rangers heard his own words, which suddenly seemed so distant. He had always believed he was acting for protection, but now he realized that his actions had become a tool of oppression. Every episode, every humiliation, was not just a job, it was his reality, which he had created himself. The trials began quickly, awaiting the consequences of his actions. Rangers found himself in the role of the defendant. As soon as it became known about the upcoming trial, the public actively followed the events. People gathered outside the courts with placards, demanding justice for all those affected by his actions. The trial became a symbol of the struggle for rights, where every voice, previously silenced by fear, now cried out for justice. Cases that had once seemed routine to him were now parts of a larger mosaic in which Rangers was just one of the players. His life had been turned upside down, and he could no longer be in the familiar role of protector. He was now an object of discussion, a target for criticism, and a symbol of the racial hatred he himself had fomented. And so the day of the trial came. The hall was full. The press, the victims, the activists, they all gathered to watch the law being enforced. From that moment on, justice left him no chance. The jury, after hearing all the facts and evidence, sent him to prison for abuse of power and racial discrimination. It was a symbolic moment not only for James Williams, but for the entire community. Every step of the process and its outcome represented hope for change and served as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of power, the law must be on the side of justice. Rangers realized this too late. His story was a warning, an embodiment that every evil, no matter how small, would eventually be exposed. Several months had passed since the Rangers' trial, and a society still reeling from the events had undergone significant changes. The incident was not just a black mark in history, but a landmark moment that awakened many people to activism and reflection on racial prejudice and justice. Discussions about fairness and racism filled public forums, schools and workplaces. People began to realize the importance of actively challenging bias, and these conversations became an integral part of everyday life. Seminars, trainings, and events began to take place in cities and villages across the country to educate the community on how to respond to discrimination and protect human rights. With James Williams, new alliances and support groups formed in local communities to protect the rights and voices of those previously afraid to speak out. James became a leading figure in these efforts. He didn't just speak, but organized events, held roundtables, and worked with youth to create a future free of fear and bias. We must realize that our actions matter, he said at an event. We cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of others. Each of us can make the world a better place by showing compassion and fighting for justice. Inspired by his words, local residents began to engage in initiatives to change police laws. As a result of public discussions and protests, a series of legislative reforms were initiated to increase transparency and accountability of police actions. These reforms also included mandatory racial sensitivity and human rights training for police officers to prevent the recurrence of such incidents in the future. The city authorities, realizing the importance of changing the climate in the police department, began auditing their actions. A system became available that allowed citizens to file complaints about police misconduct, which had direct access to independent investigative bodies. This allowed people to begin to trust their advocates again, knowing that their voices would be heard and their rights protected. The negative consequences of the Rangers case were seemingly devastating, but they served as a catalyst for change that, in contrast to the bitterness and humiliation, provided an opportunity for growth and learning. Residents began to participate more actively in local elections, paying attention to candidates who offered plans to improve public safety and human rights. Over time, more and more people began to realize that prejudice was not something predetermined. Everyone could be part of the change, from the ordinary citizen to the high-ranking official. With each new discussion, each new step towards justice, society became more united and determined. At the heart of all these changes was James Williams. His experience and determination became a symbol of hope for many. He often recalled his own fears and worries, but as he looked at the progress they had made, he realized that every struggle had been worthwhile. Every sweat shed, every tear, every night spent worrying, it all resulted in a world that was a little better. In one of his meetings with young activists, he made a simple but profound point. We must remember that justice is not just a word, it is a choice we make every day. If we are willing to speak up, if we are willing to act, we can change everything. This story, which began with conflict and injustice, turned into a lesson for the entire community. It was not only a story about James and the Rangers, but about all those who fight prejudice, who are not afraid to stand up for the truth. And, as always in life, hope for the best is what leads the way forward. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.